You may believe you are making conscious choices every day, but Carl Jung believed something far more unsettling. He believed that most of your decisions are not truly yours. According to Jung, the mind is not governed by logic alone. Beneath conscious intention lies the shadow, a hidden psychological force made of everything you were taught to reject, suppress, or deny. This shadow does not disappear. It waits. And when ignored, it begins to decide for you. The shadow controls your decisions not by force, but by invisibility. It influences what attracts you, what repels you, what excites you, and what terrifies you. You think you are choosing freely, but Jung would say you are often reacting automatically to unconscious material that has never been examined. This is why people repeatedly make choices that contradict their goals. They say they want peace, yet choose conflict. They say they want growth, yet avoid discomfort. They say they want love, yet sabotage intimacy. These are not random mistakes. They are expressions of an unconscious inner life seeking recognition. Jung explained that whatever is denied conscious expression seeks expression elsewhere. If you suppress anger, it leaks out as passive aggression. If you deny ambition, it turns into resentment. If you reject vulnerability, it becomes control. The shadow always finds a way to act, even if the ego pretends it does not exist. This is where dark psychology enters. A person who does not understand their shadow is easy to manipulate. Their triggers are predictable. Their fears are accessible. Their emotional reactions can be provoked on command. Jung warned that unconscious people are not free, no matter how intelligent they appear. In everyday life, this looks familiar. You stay in relationships you know are unhealthy. You delay decisions that would move your life forward. You react emotionally to small events and later regret it. Jung would say these moments are not lapses in discipline. They are moments where the shadow took control. Consider how often you explain your choices after making them. The explanation feels logical, even convincing. But the impulse came first. Jung believed the ego is often a narrator, not a commander. It tells a story that preserves the illusion of control. The shadow also influences what you avoid. Opportunities that would force you to grow. Conversations that would expose truth. Silence that would reveal inner conflict. Avoidance is not laziness. It is unconscious resistance. The psyche protects itself from what it is not ready to face. This resistance becomes especially visible under stress. When you are tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally charged, the ego weakens. And what emerges is not your ideal self, but your actual one. Jung believed these moments reveal the truth of your psychology, not an exception to it. The uncomfortable truth is that the shadow is not your enemy. Your blindness to it is. The shadow contains destructive impulses, yes, but it also contains strength, creativity, assertiveness, and instinct. Many people are not weak because they lack power. They are weak because their power was buried early in life. When you begin to recognize the shadow, your decisions change. Not because impulses disappear, but because you see them forming. Awareness creates space. And in that space, choice becomes possible. Jung believed that consciousness is not about control, but about relationship. You cannot eliminate the shadow. You can only integrate it. And integration means responsibility. Taking ownership of what you are capable of, both light and dark. When you do this, the shadow loses its compulsive grip. It no longer needs to sabotage you to be heard. Until then, it will continue to decide where you go, who you choose, and what you avoid. Until the shadow is faced, it will control you. If you want to understand how hidden forces shape your decisions, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with what this made you reflect on. Like the video to support the work. And share it with someone who keeps repeating the same patterns without knowing why. Tomorrow, we go even deeper. Most people assume that self-control means suppressing impulses. Jung believed this idea was not only wrong, but dangerous. Suppression does not create control. It creates pressure. And pressure always looks for a release. The shadow does not disappear when you try to be disciplined, positive, or morally correct. It simply adapts. It waits for moments when the ego is tired, distracted, or emotionally overwhelmed. That is when it takes the wheel. This is why people often say, "I don't know what came over me." Jung would say exactly that happened. True self-control, from a Jungian perspective, begins with self-knowledge. You cannot regulate what you refuse to acknowledge. The more unaware you are of your impulses, the more absolute their power becomes. Awareness weakens compulsion. Not instantly, but progressively. This is why rigid self-discipline often backfires. A person who defines themselves as calm may explode. A person who prides themselves on rationality may act irrationally under pressure. A person who sees themselves as selfless may harbor intense resentment. The shadow compensates for whatever the ego exaggerates. Jung believed that the shadow is especially active in moments of choice. Not because it wants to ruin your life, but because it wants expression. When the conscious mind hesitates, the unconscious acts. This is why important decisions often feel emotionally charged rather than logically clear. You can observe this in simple situations. You delay sending a message that would clarify a relationship. You postpone a decision that would commit you to a path. You distract yourself just as focus is required. These are not neutral habits. They are unconscious strategies to avoid inner confrontation. The shadow also influences attraction. Jung believed that what draws you powerfully often represents something you have disowned. You are fascinated by people who express traits you suppress. You are repelled by people who mirror your denied flaws. Attraction and aversion are psychological clues, not random preferences. This is why manipulation works so well on unconscious people. A manipulator does not need to control you directly. They only need to activate your shadow, your fear of rejection, your need for approval, your unacknowledged anger, your desire to feel powerful. Once activated, you act for them without realizing it. Jung warned that the greatest danger is not external control, but internal blindness. A person who knows their shadow cannot be easily provoked. A person who does not know it can be controlled by anyone who learns their triggers. This is also why people repeat the same mistakes even after understanding them intellectually. Insight without integration changes nothing. You may know why you sabotage yourself, yet still do it. Jung would say the knowledge has not reached the level where the behavior originates. Integration requires presence. Catching yourself in the moment of impulse. Feeling the emotion without acting it out blindly. Naming the motive instead of justifying the action. This is uncomfortable. But discomfort is the price of freedom. The shadow resists this process. It prefers to remain unconscious because unconsciousness gives it absolute influence. When seen, it must negotiate. And negotiation feels like loss of power. Jung believed that many people mistake their lack of progress for a lack of willpower. In reality, they lack dialogue with their unconscious. They fight themselves instead of understanding themselves. And no one wins a war against their own psyche. As long as the shadow remains unseen, it will continue to decide for you. What you avoid, what you chase, what you destroy, what you repeat. But the moment you begin to observe it honestly, something changes. The decisions that once felt automatic begin to slow down. And in that pause, real choice begins to appear. There is a subtle moment that most people miss, a brief internal pause right before a decision is made. Jung believed this moment is where freedom either appears or disappears. When you are unconscious, the pause collapses instantly into action. When you are aware, the pause expands, and with it, choice. The shadow hates this pause. It prefers speed, automatic reactions, familiar patterns. The faster you move, the less likely you are to notice what is driving you. This is why modern life, with its constant urgency and stimulation, strengthens unconscious behavior. Jung would say distraction is not accidental. It protects the shadow from exposure. This is also why people feel uncomfortable in silence. Silence removes external input and allows inner material to surface. Thoughts you don't want. Feelings you've avoided. Desires that complicate your self-image. The shadow begins to speak when there is nothing else to listen to. Instead of hearing it, most people escape. They reach for noise, entertainment, productivity, or conflict. Anything to avoid that inner encounter. Jung believed this avoidance is the reason so many people feel restless even when their lives look stable on the outside. The shadow also operates through moralization. You justify your impulses by turning them into principles. Control becomes high standards. Fear becomes being realistic. Avoidance becomes patience. Jung warned that when behavior is over-explained, something unconscious is often being protected. This is why self-honesty is more threatening than self-discipline. Discipline allows the ego to remain in charge. Honesty threatens its authority. To admit, "I am avoiding this because I am afraid," weakens the shadow's grip. To admit, "I enjoy this because it gives me power," breaks the illusion of innocence. Jung believed that many people confuse goodness with repression. They believe that denying darker impulses makes them virtuous. In reality, it makes them blind. A person who knows their capacity for harm can regulate it. A person who denies it will express it unconsciously. This unconscious expression often looks indirect. Sarcasm instead of anger. Withdrawal instead of confrontation. Sabotage instead of refusal. The shadow is not subtle because it is weak. It is subtle because subtlety keeps it hidden. In relationships, this dynamic becomes painfully clear. You say you want closeness, but withdraw when intimacy deepens. You say you want honesty, but punish it when it appears. Jung would say the shadow fears exposure more than loneliness. It would rather repeat suffering than risk self-awareness. In positions of authority, the shadow becomes even more dangerous. When power amplifies unconscious traits, control replaces leadership. Manipulation replaces influence. Jung believed that the most destructive leaders are not cruel by intention, but unconscious of their own drives. The same principle applies internally. When unconscious impulses gain power, they dominate the psyche. When they are acknowledged, they become manageable. Not obedient, but accountable. Jung emphasized that integration does not mean liking your shadow. It means recognizing it as part of your psychological reality. You do not negotiate with something you deny. You do not regulate what you refuse to see. As awareness grows, something counterintuitive happens. The shadow begins to lose interest in sabotage. It no longer needs to shock the ego to be noticed. Energy once spent on repetition becomes available for creativity, focus, and genuine action. This is where real self-control begins. Not with force, but with recognition. Not with suppression, but with presence. Not with ideals, but with truth. Until then, the shadow remains the invisible hand behind your choices. And it never stops pulling. Many people believe that once they recognize a pattern, it should immediately disappear. Jung strongly disagreed. He believed that awareness does not erase the shadow. It changes the relationship with it. And relationship takes time. The shadow has momentum. It was formed over years, sometimes decades. It learned how to survive without your consent. So when you begin to observe it, it does not surrender quietly. At first, it often becomes louder, more insistent, more creative in finding ways to express itself. Jung warned that this phase often discourages people from continuing the work. They think, "I'm becoming worse." In reality, they are becoming more conscious. Before awareness, the shadow acted invisibly. After awareness, it acts visibly. This visibility feels like loss of control, but it is actually the first step toward real control. You cannot regulate what you cannot see. This is why many people abandon self-awareness work too early. They mistake exposure for failure. Jung believed that staying present during this phase is critical. The psyche is testing whether you are serious about dialogue or whether you will retreat back into denial. Another illusion Jung dismantled is the belief that the shadow only contains negative traits. In reality, it often holds your unused strength, your assertiveness, your ambition, your creative instinct. Many people are not held back by weakness, but by unclaimed power. If you were taught that being strong made you dangerous, strength went into the shadow. If you were taught that wanting more made you selfish, ambition went into the shadow. If you were taught that expressing emotion made you vulnerable, authenticity went into the shadow. Later in life, these disowned qualities return in distorted forms. Strength becomes aggression. Ambition becomes envy. Emotion becomes instability. Jung believed that reclaiming these qualities consciously transforms them back into their healthy expression. This is why shadow work is not about becoming darker. It is about becoming more real. In decision-making, this integration is decisive. A person who knows their desire for power can channel it responsibly. A person who denies it will seek control unconsciously. A person who knows their fear of rejection can act despite it. A person who denies it will shape their entire life around avoiding it. Jung believed that unconscious motives narrow your future. Conscious motives expand it. When you don't know why you choose something, you are limited to repetition. When you do know, you gain options. This also explains why some people feel strangely calm in chaos. They are not fearless. They are familiar with their inner darkness. Chaos does not shock them because they have already encountered it internally. Jung believed that people who have met their shadow are harder to manipulate and harder to destabilize. They still feel emotion. They still experience desire and fear. But these forces no longer rule from the shadows. They operate in daylight. The final illusion Jung challenged is the idea that freedom means eliminating inner conflict. He believed the opposite. Freedom means holding conflict consciously without being possessed by it. You are not free when impulses disappear. You are free when impulses no longer decide for you. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, it will keep choosing on your behalf. It will shape your relationships, your work, your reactions, and your future without explanation. But when you face it honestly, even briefly, something irreversible happens. You stop being entirely predictable. And that is where real autonomy begins. At a deeper level, Jung believed the shadow is not just personal, but existential. It is not only about habits, impulses, or childhood conditioning. It is about the parts of yourself that contradict the life you believe you should live. Every time your inner truth clashes with your outer structure, the shadow is formed. This is why people often feel an unexplainable resistance toward paths that would objectively improve their lives. It is not laziness. It is not lack of intelligence. It is the psyche protecting an internal equilibrium, even if that equilibrium is painful. Change threatens identity. And identity, even when false, feels like survival. The shadow becomes especially active when a choice would force you to abandon a familiar version of yourself. A version built on suffering, sacrifice, or limitation. Jung noticed that many people are unconsciously loyal to their pain. It gives them meaning. It gives them predictability. It gives them an identity. If you let go of the pattern, who are you? This question terrifies the unconscious more than failure ever could. So it intervenes. It produces doubt. It creates fear disguised as logic. It floods you with emotions that feel justified but are strategically timed. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not stupid. It is adaptive. It knows exactly how to stop you without revealing itself. This is why self-sabotage often appears just before progress. Just before intimacy deepens. Just before commitment. Just before visibility. The shadow senses exposure. And exposure feels like annihilation to a structure built on concealment. From a Jungian perspective, procrastination is not about time management. It is about identity management. You are delaying not the task, but the version of yourself that would have to exist if the task were completed. Success forces integration. Failure allows fragmentation to continue. The same applies to destructive decisions. Jung believed that people often choose what harms them because it confirms an unconscious self-image. If you secretly believe you are unworthy, you will gravitate toward situations that prove it. Not consciously, but compulsively. The shadow seeks coherence, even if that coherence is tragic. This is where the idea of fate becomes psychological. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What feels like destiny is often repetition. The same inner script playing out in different environments. You change jobs, but the conflict remains. You change partners, but the dynamic returns. You change cities, but the dissatisfaction follows. The shadow travels with you. What makes this unsettling is that the shadow does not feel like an enemy. It feels like you. Its impulses arrive with emotional certainty. Its justifications sound reasonable. Jung warned that the most dangerous lies are the ones you tell yourself convincingly. This is why dark psychology focuses so heavily on emotional leverage. When someone activates your shadow, you feel compelled, not convinced. You act quickly, defensively, excessively, and afterward, you wonder why you behaved that way. The decision was never debated. It was triggered. Jung believed that triggers are not weaknesses. They are signals. Each trigger marks a place where consciousness ends and automatism begins. If you follow the trigger instead of fighting it, it leads you directly to unconscious material. But this requires a shift in attitude. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this behavior?" Jung would ask, "What part of me needs to be seen?" Stopping without understanding only drives the shadow deeper. Seeing transforms it. This is why true self-control is quiet. It is not rigid. It is not moralistic. It is observant. The more you observe without immediately acting, the more the shadow loses urgency. It no longer needs to hijack behavior to exist. Over time, something subtle but powerful happens. Decisions begin to feel less dramatic, less emotionally charged, less compulsive. Not because life is easier, but because inner conflict is being metabolized instead of acted out. Jung believed that this is how autonomy develops. Not by eliminating desire or fear, but by understanding their role in the psyche. When motives are conscious, they can be negotiated. When they are unconscious, they dictate. As long as the shadow remains hidden, it will keep choosing your reactions, your relationships, and your future paths. And it will do so convincingly, because it knows you better than you know yourself. There is a reason Jung believed that people fear self-knowledge more than suffering. Suffering can be blamed on circumstances. Self-knowledge removes excuses. The moment you see the shadow clearly, you can no longer pretend you didn't know. And responsibility quietly enters the room. The psyche resists this moment fiercely. When unconscious patterns are exposed, the ego often tries to regain control by intellectualizing them. You analyze yourself. You label behaviors. You repeat insights. But Jung warned that insight without emotional contact is another form of avoidance. The shadow is not dissolved by understanding alone. It is transformed by relationship. This is why people can talk about their patterns endlessly and still repeat them. They understand the story, but they have not felt the tension underneath it. The unconscious does not change because you describe it accurately. It changes when you stay present with what it carries. Jung believed that many decisions feel urgent precisely because they bypass consciousness. Urgency collapses reflection. It pushes you to act before awareness can intervene. This is why people often say yes when they mean no, stay when they should leave, speak when silence would be wiser, or remain silent when truth is needed. The shadow thrives on immediacy. In contrast, consciousness introduces delay. Not hesitation, but space. Space where conflicting impulses can coexist without one immediately overpowering the other. Jung believed this space is the foundation of maturity, the ability to tolerate inner tension without discharge. Most people cannot tolerate this tension. They resolve it quickly through action. Any action, even destructive action, feels better than unresolved conflict. This is why people make decisions they later regret. Regret is often the cost of escaping tension too quickly. The shadow also distorts perception. When it is activated, the world appears threatening or seductive in exaggerated ways. A small comment feels like rejection. A minor opportunity feels like salvation. Jung believed that when perception is distorted, decision-making cannot be trusted. You are not responding to reality. You are responding to inner material projected outward. This explains why two people can experience the same situation completely differently. One remains calm. The other reacts intensely. The difference is not character. It is unconscious content. The situation touched something unresolved in one psyche and not in the other. Jung believed that projection is one of the shadow's most powerful tools. You see your denied impulses, fears, or desires in others and react to them as if they belonged entirely to the external world. This allows the ego to remain innocent while still expressing the shadow indirectly. Hatred, obsession, moral outrage, blind admiration. These are rarely about the other person alone. They are mirrors. And mirrors are uncomfortable because they reflect what you have not integrated. This is why shadow-driven decisions often feel morally justified. You are not acting impulsively. You are standing up for yourself. You are not avoiding responsibility. You are protecting your peace. Jung warned that when language becomes defensive, unconscious motives are often at work. The shadow does not argue honestly. It persuades emotionally. Another subtle way the shadow controls decisions is through identity fatigue. When a role has been maintained for too long, the psyche rebels. The dutiful one suddenly acts irresponsibly. The controlled one suddenly loses control. The agreeable one suddenly becomes harsh. Jung believed these breakdowns are attempts at psychic balance. The tragedy is that when these eruptions occur unconsciously, they create damage rather than integration. Relationships suffer. Trust erodes. Shame follows. And instead of learning, the ego tightens control even more, pushing the shadow further underground. This creates a cycle. Suppression. Explosion. Shame. Suppression again. Jung believed that breaking this cycle requires courage of a specific kind. Not the courage to fight impulses, but the courage to sit with them without acting or judging. To say internally, "This exists in me," without immediately explaining it away. This attitude changes everything. When the shadow feels acknowledged, it no longer needs to hijack decisions. The urgency softens. The compulsion weakens. The psyche begins to cooperate instead of rebel. Over time, decisions that once felt charged with anxiety or excitement become clearer. Not easier, but clearer. You begin to sense which choices are driven by fear, which by desire, and which by genuine alignment. Jung believed that this clarity is the difference between being driven and being directed, between reacting and choosing, between fate and agency. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, it will continue to influence your decisions invisibly, convincingly, and persistently. And most people will never realize that the voice they trust most is the one they have never questioned. What Jung found most disturbing was not that people had a shadow, but that they defended it without knowing it. They would argue passionately for choices that harmed them, protect patterns that diminished them, and rationalize behaviors that quietly eroded their lives. And they would do so with complete sincerity. From the inside, the shadow does not feel destructive. It feels necessary. Jung believed this is because the shadow is tied to survival memory. It formed at moments when certain traits, emotions, or desires became dangerous to express. The psyche learned quickly. It buried what threatened belonging and kept what ensured acceptance. Over time, this adaptation became automatic. The problem is that survival strategies age badly. What protected you at 10 can imprison you at 30. What kept you safe in one environment becomes sabotage in another. But the unconscious does not update itself automatically. It repeats what once worked until it is consciously revised. This is why people often outgrow situations externally but remain internally trapped. They are living with an outdated psychological operating system. Jung believed that much of adult suffering comes from this mismatch between present reality and past adaptation. The shadow enforces this mismatch through emotional reactions that feel disproportionate. Fear that arrives too fast. Anger that lasts too long. Desire that overrides judgment. These reactions are not random. They are echoes of earlier conditions, resurfacing in new contexts. This is also where control enters the picture. When the shadow feels threatened, it seeks control. Control over outcomes. Control over people. Control over self-image. Jung believed that the need to control is often the ego's attempt to compensate for unconscious fear. The less you trust your inner world, the more you try to dominate the outer one. This is why highly controlling individuals are often internally fragmented. They are not strong. They are defending against inner chaos. Control becomes a substitute for integration. In relationships, this manifests subtly. You may try to manage how others see you. You may avoid vulnerability under the guise of independence. You may provoke reactions just to feel grounded. Jung believed that many relational conflicts are not about incompatibility, but about unintegrated shadow material seeking expression. The same dynamic appears in leadership and authority. Jung warned that people who have not confronted their shadow are especially dangerous when given power. Their unconscious impulses hide behind ideology, duty, or morality. They believe they are acting for the greater good, while secretly discharging inner conflicts. History, Jung argued, is filled with examples of collective shadows acting through individuals who lacked self-awareness. On a personal level, this means that every time you avoid looking inward, you increase the likelihood that your unconscious will act outward. What is not reflected will be projected. What is not integrated will be imposed. This is why Jung believed self-knowledge is an ethical responsibility, not a luxury. Your inner darkness does not stay private. It leaks into decisions, tone, reactions, and relationships. You may think you are hiding it. Others feel it. Another overlooked aspect of the shadow is pleasure. Not all shadow material is painful. Some of it is forbidden enjoyment. The things you want but believe you shouldn't. The impulses that feel alive but conflict with your self-image. Jung believed repression of pleasure is just as destabilizing as repression of anger or fear. Denied pleasure often returns as compulsion. What could have been chosen consciously becomes addictive unconsciously. Moderation is only possible when desire is acknowledged. Otherwise, the shadow takes over and seeks excess. This is why willpower alone fails. Willpower is an ego function. The shadow operates beneath it. You cannot overpower what you refuse to recognize. Jung believed that lasting change happens when the ego stops trying to dominate the psyche and starts listening to it. Listening does not mean obeying. It means understanding the language of symptoms, urges, fantasies, and emotional spikes. These are communications. Not enemies. Not flaws. Signals. When you begin to interpret these signals instead of suppressing them, the psyche shifts. The shadow no longer needs to shout. It has been heard. And when it is heard, something quietly radical happens. You begin to sense, before acting, whether a decision is coming from fear, compensation, rebellion, or genuine intent. That pause changes everything. It interrupts the automatic chain between impulse and action. Jung believed this pause is where freedom lives. Not in perfection. Not in purity. But in awareness. As long as the shadow remains unseen, it will continue to guide your choices while pretending to be your instincts, your logic, your personality. And the most convincing illusion of all is believing that those voices are entirely yours. Jung observed that the moment a person begins to sense their shadow, a strange paradox appears. On one hand, there is relief. Things finally make sense. On the other, there is fear. Because what is being discovered cannot be undiscovered. Innocence is lost. And with it, the comfort of unconscious living. This is why many people hover at the edge of self-awareness but never fully cross it. They read. They listen. They feel momentarily exposed. Then they retreat. Jung believed this retreat is not cowardice, but grief. Grief for the image of oneself that can no longer be maintained. To see the shadow is to accept that you are not purely good, rational, or consistent. You are layered, contradictory, capable of impulses that do not fit your narrative. The ego resists this because it thrives on coherence. It wants a clean story. The shadow ruins the story. But Jung believed that a clean story is a fragile one. Real psychological strength does not come from believing you are good. It comes from knowing what you are capable of and choosing consciously anyway. Without that knowledge, morality is accidental. You behave well because circumstances allow it. Change the pressure, and the shadow takes over. This is why Jung distrusted moral perfection. He saw it as untested innocence. And untested innocence collapses under stress. The shadow reveals itself most clearly under pressure. Fatigue, rejection, power, desire. These states weaken the ego's control and allow unconscious material to surface. What emerges in those moments is not a mistake. It is information. Jung believed that how you act when you are tired, frustrated, or tempted is more revealing than how you act when things are calm. The shadow waits for the ego to be distracted. Then it steps forward. This is also why certain situations feel oddly compelling even when they are harmful. The shadow is drawn to experiences that allow it expression. Chaos, drama, intensity. These environments loosen social constraints and make unconscious behavior permissible. Jung believed some people repeatedly enter destructive situations not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering gives their shadow room to breathe. Stability, for an unintegrated psyche, can feel suffocating. This creates a dangerous misunderstanding. People believe they are just like this, that they thrive in chaos, that they need intensity. Jung would say they are confusing necessity with pathology. What they need is not chaos, but integration. Chaos is just the only place their shadow feels alive. When the shadow is integrated, intensity is no longer required. Energy becomes available in ordinary life. Creativity increases. Presence deepens. Decisions become less dramatic. Jung believed that much of what people call passion is actually unresolved inner conflict seeking discharge. Another way the shadow controls decisions is through self-image protection. You avoid choices that would contradict how you see yourself, even if those choices would help you grow. The unconscious asks one question repeatedly: who would I be if I did this? If the answer threatens the current identity, resistance appears. You delay. You doubt. You sabotage. Jung believed that growth always requires a small death of identity. Something familiar must be relinquished. The shadow guards the old identity fiercely because it was built for survival. This is why people often cling to labels. Victim, strong one, responsible one, rebel. Labels simplify the psyche, but they also imprison it. The shadow holds everything that does not fit the label. And the more rigid the label, the larger the shadow becomes. Eventually, the tension demands release. Sometimes it comes as burnout. Sometimes as a breakdown. Sometimes as a sudden, inexplicable decision that shocks everyone, including the person who made it. Jung believed these moments are not accidents. They are compensations. The psyche forcing balance when consciousness refuses to negotiate. What is tragic is that these compensations often look like self-destruction from the outside. Quitting abruptly. Ending relationships impulsively. Acting out of character. But from the inside, they feel inevitable. As if something took over. Something did. The shadow does not announce itself. It simply acts when it has waited long enough. Jung believed that the goal is not to prevent these forces from existing, but to prevent them from acting blindly. To bring them into dialogue before they erupt. This requires humility. The willingness to admit that you do not fully know yourself, even now. When this humility is present, something shifts. You stop identifying completely with every thought, urge, or emotion. You begin to witness them. Not as enemies, but as parts. Parts with histories. Parts with reasons. And in that witnessing, the shadow begins to lose its authority. It no longer needs to hijack your life to be acknowledged. But until that moment arrives, it will continue to influence your choices quietly, persistently, and with remarkable intelligence. Because the shadow is not chaos. It is order that was never allowed into consciousness. Carl Jung believed that the real danger is not the shadow itself, but believing you are free from it. Because what you deny does not disappear. It waits. It adapts. And it chooses for you when you least expect it. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, your decisions will feel personal, but they will not be free. You will call them instinct, intuition, personality, or fate. But beneath the surface, old survival patterns will still be steering the direction of your life. Facing the shadow does not make you darker. It makes you honest. And honesty is what turns reaction into choice. Until the shadow is faced, it will control you. Once it is faced, it can no longer rule from the dark. If this resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. Give this video a like to support the content. Leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences. And share it with someone who needs to understand how the mind truly works. Because self-awareness is not comfortable, but it is the beginning of real freedom.